When I was a child, my mother had a saying. She would say, "Lydia, don't beat it into the ground." Like many children, if I had a favorite joke, I told it over and over again until everybody was tired of it. If I had a favorite song, I sang it over and over again until everybody was tired of it. I can tell some stories on myself about that, but I won't right now. When it comes to this development theory of greater engagement with Phariseeism, as the Gospels go on chronologically getting later, I am unabashedly beating it into the ground. I'm doing so by considering category after category of stories and showing how, again and again, there is just no pattern. And I'm doing that because I want my viewers who stick with me through the series never again, when confronted with a development claim, even from a New Testament scholar, biblical scholar that you respect, to accept that uncritically and to assume that they must have a good argument for it. It just ain't true. Gospel development claims really are all bunk. And that's why I'm beating this into the ground. But in pity on my viewers, what I'm going to do today is a slightly longer video where I'm going to talk about several different things, several different categories, including a miscellaneous category. It's not really, kind of an anti-category. Just miscellaneous mentions of Pharisees in the Gospels, so that the series doesn't go on forever. There will still be more videos in the series, but I'm not going to break every category up into a separate video. So I'm going to do 3 today. Plots, traps, and then miscellaneous references. Okay, so the first category I'm going to talk about today of mentions of the Pharisees in the Gospels is plots. And what I'm including here are places where the Pharisees are mentioned as being involved in a plan to kill Jesus or to arrest Jesus. So that seems like a pretty natural category. This is the only category of all those that I'm considering which, taken just in isolation, has at least, something like the line that Keener attributes. Remember, he says that Matthew engages with Pharisaism more than Luke and Mark, and that John does so more than Matthew. Well, we'll see here, just in this plots one, you have one more explicit mention of the Pharisees' involvement in a plot against Jesus in Matthew than you have in Mark or Luke, and you have one more in John than you have in Matthew. So, congratulations, we passed the first step, that we're at least describing the data in a way that could, in theory, fit with the alleged pattern. It of course barely makes that cutoff, and it is entirely outweighed by all of the other places, all of the other categories, some of which we'll see today when we get to traps and miscellaneous mentions that go in the other direction. So it does not a pattern make, much less is it plausible to attribute this to some kind of programmatic intentions on the part of Matthew and John. It just happens that Matthew has one more story, and then John has one more story, numerically more than Matthew. These aren't even all overlapping. So, plots to arrest and or kill Jesus. In Mark and Matthew, here at a very early point in his ministry, Mark and Matthew both say that the Pharisees, among others, Mark mentions the Herodians, were plotting as to how they might destroy Jesus. This is due to their anger over the man with the withered hand incident. Now, I want to emphasize this is a very important counterexample all by itself to some a priori history that Keener engages in concerning John. We'll be talking about this more in later videos, that when John says that the Pharisees were just involved along with the chief priests in sending temple guards to try to arrest Jesus, this is not historically plausible. Keener says they wouldn't have had that kind of authority. But here we find in Mark, that's considered the very earliest gospel, he portrays them at a different point in Jesus' ministry, just like, hey, how can we kill this guy? Okay, and they clearly think that they do have the clout to at least be involved in, among other groups, involved in some kind of coalition to try to kill Jesus. So that all by itself is an important counterexample to, they wouldn't have been involved in any coalition to try to kill Jesus. And so John must be putting that in there non-historically to appeal to his readers or something. All right. Then, in addition, there's one plot that is unique in Matthew. It isn't that the plot is unique, I should say, but that the mention of the Pharisees, specifically by name. All three of the synoptics agree that the religious leaders wanted to seize Jesus immediately after the parable of the wicked tenants, the parable of the vineyard, as it's sometimes called, during Holy Week, but that they feared the people. Matthew's the only one here who names the Pharisees as being involved there. The others say the scribes and the chief priests, or they wanted to kill him. They wanted to seize him. That's, of course, compatible with the Pharisees' involvement, but only Matthew lists them specifically. All right, and then unique to John, we have three plots. All right, so you've got, in other words, 2 in Matthew, 3 in John. In John 7:32, the Pharisees and the chief priests together send the temple guard to try to arrest Jesus. This is one of the places where Keener treats the involvement of the Pharisees as historically implausible. This is a visit to Jerusalem not recorded in the synoptics, and there's really no reason why the Pharisees couldn't have been involved along with the chief priests sending the temple guard. Okay, John 11:47-57 describes a sort of emergency meeting of the various religious rulers, including Caiaphas and other priests, and Pharisees are mentioned. And in the wake of that, the leaders issue orders that they're trying to find somebody who can tell them how to find Jesus, to arrest him. And this is after the raising of Lazarus. They're like, what are we going to do about this guy? And Caiaphas clearly implies that they should try to kill him. Caiaphas being probably not a Pharisee, probably a Sadducee. Okay, but the Pharisees are involved. John 18:3 has a lot of unique details. John 18 has a lot of unique details about Jesus' arrest in the garden. Of course, all the Gospels tell about Jesus being arrested in the garden, but John mentions, for example, the name of the man whose ear was cut off and so forth, several other things. And among other unique details, he mentions that the Pharisees and chief priests sent those doing the arresting. So once again, we have Pharisaic involvement in having Jesus arrested. That's another place, the historicity of which Keener challenges, that probably reflects John's historical situation, he says, rather than the actual historical involvement of the Pharisees with the chief priests and sending the guards, people who arrest Jesus. All right. And as I've said all along, we shouldn't really be making anything of these. These are very small numerical differences, and I've been consistent with that because I've consistently found Luke having somewhat more than any other gospel, of some negative category of interactions between Jesus and the Pharisees. And I'm like, so what? That doesn't mean Luke had some specific anti-Pharisee agenda either. Now, I'll be later, next time, talking about Keener's claim that in John, the Pharisees are identical with the opposition, which is ridiculous. And in these plot scenes, as an example, they're not alone in these plot scenes. They're working with the chief priests. All right. Moreover, the survey of this category shows that described broadly the Pharisees' involvement in arresting and killing Jesus is multiply attested. We have different stories in Mark, Matthew, and John, different incidents where it says the Pharisees are involved in plots to kill Jesus. Things don't need to be multiply attested, but when they are, it's definitely a nice bonus. So, and it's even supposed to be a critical scholarly criterion. And so here, the Pharisees' involvement in plots to kill Jesus is multiply attested across three different Gospels, including Mark, that seems to get a little more, respect, sometimes historically, from critical scholars. So, like, why should we doubt it? All right, I'm going to move on to traps, category of traps. And what I mean by traps is places where Jesus is sort of being set up. What are you going to do, Jesus? Or what are you going to say in answer to this question? Now here we return to the far more common outcome, which is that there are way more in the synoptics than in John. And there's just no pattern at all. So in some of these cases, I'm going to be going back to things that I talked about earlier that I called rules controversies. But here I want to emphasize the fact that not only were they controversies over the rules that the Pharisees had made, they were also setups of Jesus, places where they were like, what's he going to do? All right, so 2 or more synoptics. We have the healing of the man with the withered hand that I mentioned before. He heals him on the Sabbath. That's found in all 3 of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And specifically, it says explicitly they were trying to find something to accuse him with, and they watched him. They wanted to know what Jesus was going to do. Here's a man, kind of, hey, dude, go stand in front of Jesus. Let's see what he'll do. Will he heal on the Sabbath? So it's a trap. All right, in all of the synoptics. All right, here's another trap. In Mark 10 and Matthew 19, they talk about the Pharisees coming to Jesus and testing him by asking about divorce. All right, so Mark and Matthew both give this story, and they both treat it as like a test. What is Jesus going to say? All right, Mark and Matthew, the story of, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? Mark and Matthew both say the Pharisees and the Herodians came and asked him this. It's not unique to Matthew. And they're trying to set him up. They want to see. And of course, he gives this very clever answer. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's, after asking to see a denarius. I should add here that Luke seems to be agreeing, though he doesn't name the Pharisees at the time of the question about taxes, but he does say, after the woes to the Pharisees, Luke says the scribes and Pharisees were questioning Jesus, trying to catch him in something that he might say, and being hostile. And there he just says, this happened after this, that's what they were doing. And then later on, some chapters later, he narrates is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? So I think plausibly Luke is agreeing there about their involvement, though he only mentions scribes and chief priests when you get to the story about paying taxes. But it's clearly an incident of the pattern that he's mentioned. They're hostile. They're trying to catch him in his talk. All right. Here's one that's unique to Luke. The whole story of the healing of the man with dropsy is a unique rules controversy in Luke, but I didn't mention there, or, I'm mentioning it again here because it's in this thing about traps, that it's at a Pharisee's house where he's invited Jesus to eat. So he invites Jesus to his house, and then he sets him up by having this man, who, probably looks terrible, like he's got maybe swollen stomach, swollen feet, and so forth. And it says, they wanted to know what Jesus would do. Okay, so it's kind of a scuzzy thing to do. Hey, let's invite Jesus to dinner, and let's put this guy in front of him at dinner and see what he'll do to see if he'll heal him on a Sabbath. There's actually sort of a pattern in Luke of places where a Pharisee invites Jesus to eat and then gets very judgy. Okay, because another one would be eating with unwashed hands. The Pharisee has invited him to eat, and they're like, hey, why aren't you ceremonially washing your hands? All right, unique to Matthew, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And the story is also found in Mark, but Matthew's the only one who says that it was the Pharisees who asked him this other question after Jesus had embarrassed the Sadducees when they tried to ask him a gotcha question. Then the Pharisees are like, hey, what can we ask him? But let's try again ourselves to ask him something, see if we can catch him. Now, when you go to John, literally the only thing that looks like one of these traps where they're setting Jesus up, what's he going to do, what's he going to say, is the story of the woman caught in adultery. Now, I think that's a historical story. But knowing which gospel it was originally in, or whether it was just part of an oral tradition about Jesus, is very much up for grabs. It's not in the earliest manuscripts of John, and in fact, in some late manuscripts, it's actually found in Luke. The style is somewhat different from John, and so I think it was historical, but it may not have been found in the original autographs, the original manuscript of John. And that does look like a trap, because she's been caught in adultery, and they bring her to Jesus, and they're like, what's she going to do? And that mentions that it's the Pharisees. That's the only one like that, the only setup like that in John. So way more in the synoptics than in John. 4 in Matthew, 3 in Mark, 3 in Luke, one of which is unique to Luke. And so if you put Luke and Mark together, it's 4 and 4 tied with Matthew, and 1 at the most in John, if indeed this was originally part of John and not part of Luke. All right, the story of the woman caught in adultery. So no pattern of, Matthew engages with Pharisaism more than Mark and Luke, and John engages with Pharisaism more than Matthew. No, he doesn't. All right, now I'm going to go to miscellaneous, which of course is not a category. It's a list of instances that just don't fit into these other categories. Most of these are at least somewhat negative. A few are sort of neutral. Some are only mildly negative, and one is positive in John, I might add. Because I've done so many other categories, there aren't miscellaneous references that are common to multiple synoptics, because I've already included the common to multiple synoptics ones under other categories. Here are the miscellaneous references to the Pharisees in Matthew that I haven't already included in another category. Unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of God. That's in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, Matthew 5:20. Matthew 9:34, the controversy about whether Jesus is casting out demons by Beelzebub. Looks like only Matthew mentions it, that the Pharisees specifically are involved there. Mark says it was the scribes sent from Jerusalem, which could easily be the Pharisees, but Mark doesn't mention that it was Pharisees. And then Matthew 27, the guard at the tomb story, which of course is unique to Matthew, and it's said to be the Pharisees who seek the guard at the tomb. All right, miscellaneous in Luke, outnumber those in Matthew, surprise, surprise. The healing of the paralytic is found in all 3 synoptics, but only Luke says that the Pharisees, as well as the scribes, were questioning Jesus, in their minds or among themselves, who can forgive sins but God alone. They're offended. And only Luke mentions the Pharisees. So remember, this is supposed to be Matthew engages more with Pharisaism than Luke. And again, it's just not true. Here it's only Luke. So are we going to say, Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a source, and Luke unhistorically mentioned that this was the Pharisees? No, he could have just had additional information, but it certainly doesn't fit the pattern that it's Matthew saying more negative stuff about the Pharisees than Luke, because, Matthew's readers were being more persecuted by the Pharisees. All right, the incident with the sinful woman in Luke. This is a biggie. This is another one where a Pharisee invites Jesus to his house in Luke and then gives Jesus a hard time, judges Jesus in his thoughts or in his speech. This is the third one. We had the man with dropsy, and we have the why are you eating with unwashed hands? And now we have the sinful woman. While Jesus is eating, this woman comes and washes his feet. And I think it's very clear this is a different incident in Luke earlier in Jesus' ministry than the incident of the Mary of Bethany during Holy Week. And the Pharisee host, who's been rude to Jesus and has not offered him foot washing, as would have been common for a guest to receive, is sitting there muttering or saying to himself, if he were really a prophet, he would know that this is a sinful woman touching him and he wouldn't let her in. And Jesus, gets him by talking about someone having a small debt forgiven or a big debt forgiven who will love the person who was forgiven the debt the more. And it's obviously really zinging him, unique to Luke. All right, Luke 13. The Pharisees come and tell Jesus to leave Perea quickly. It's a certain region because Herod is going to kill him. Now, it's not a super aggressive oppositional incident, but Jesus' answer, which includes very sarcastic comments about prophets dying. I've got to go to Jerusalem to die. Don't worry. Herod's not going to kill me here. I have to get to Jerusalem. Prophets always go to Jerusalem to die. Makes it pretty clear that he doesn't think they're saying this out of the goodness of their hearts. Probably taunting him. All right. Luke 17:20 I would categorize as a fairly neutral incident. The Pharisees ask Jesus when the kingdom of God will come, and he just answers them straight. All right, Luke 19:39, unique to Luke. During the triumphal entry, the Pharisees tell Jesus to rebuke his disciples who are crying out, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." And Jesus tells them that the stones will cry out if these are silent. And this, by the way, confirms the fact that the Pharisees were very upset by Jesus' influence at this time of the triumphal entry. Dovetails really well with John 12:19, where in the wake of the triumphal entry, we just have the Pharisees sort of complaining among themselves. We're not doing any good. The whole world is following after him. What are we going to do? They don't want the whole world following after Jesus. These are not the same incident exactly in Luke and John, but they multiply attest the upsetness of the Pharisees about the triumphal entry. Okay. And it's probably worth noting that in Matthew 21:15, the leaders try to get Jesus to hush up the children in the temple, specifically mentions children who are singing, Hosanna to the Son of David. They're driving it into the ground too. Probably they heard the adults singing it. And there in Matthew, it only says chief priests and scribes. So I think it's a different incident from the stones will cry out incident in Luke, but it's surrounding, the triumphal entry. And a redaction critic, I think if it went the other way, and the redaction critic was trying to say, Matthew engages more with Pharisaism, would emphasize this. But in this case, it's Luke who attributes to the Pharisees specifically, tell your disciples to shut up. And Matthew says chief priests and scribes do you hear what the children are singing, and doesn't mention the Pharisees. So much for Matthew engages more with Pharisaism than Luke. All right, miscellaneous Pharisee references in John. We're almost done. John 1:24. The Pharisees are involved in sending messengers who are priests and Levites to John the Baptist. I'm probably going to be reading more of Keener's argument here. This is a big deal to him. Very strange. Such a big deal to him as supporting this development theory, challenging the historicity of the Pharisees' involvement at this point, and using it as evidence that John is dragging in the Pharisees for reasons of relevance where they weren't really involved. It's not even all that negative. I mean, they're sort of challenging John the Baptist, but it's sort of understandable that they want to know who he is, or who he thinks he is, right? And they're just asking him questions. All right, John 3:1, the Nicodemus passage. Now, this can be regarded as positive. Nicodemus comes to Jesus. He's said to be a Pharisee by night. Now, John's a little contemptuous of the fact, I think, that he was kind of a coward, that he only comes to him by night. But he seems to be a sincere inquirer. And I think Jesus deals with him as a sincere inquirer, and he even has a sort of arc throughout the Gospel of John. Later we find Nicodemus standing up for Jesus. In fact, in John 7, and I maybe should have mentioned this when I mentioned the plots, quote unquote, that Nicodemus actually says, in our law, we don't condemn a man without hearing him. So he's sort of sticking out his neck just a little. And they even say, what are you, his follower? Are you a Galilean? Sort of little regional ethnic slur in there, which is very true to the times. So Nicodemus gradually becomes more willing to stand up to the others. We even find a certain amount of nuance in John. In John 9, it says there was disagreement among the Pharisees about the man born blind incident. So he's not just trying to drag in the Pharisees, focus in a single-minded way on the Pharisees are the baddies, and so forth. And eventually, of course, Nicodemus is involved more openly, and he goes with Joseph of Arimathea, and they're not afraid anymore. If they are afraid, they overcome their fear, and he brings a princely amount of spices to bury Jesus in. All right. John 4:1. If this is a negative reference to the Pharisees, it's not even that strong. It just says Jesus went to Galilee when he heard that the Pharisees had heard that his disciples were baptizing more people than John the Baptist. I guess he didn't want to encourage that kind of comparison. And John, then I've mentioned the plots under plots. Okay. So they're not mentioned here because I already did them under plots. John 12:42 just says that members among the rulers were afraid that they would be cast out of the synagogue because the Pharisees were involved in saying that they cast people out of the synagogue. And that's told in John 9, if they said that Jesus was the Messiah. So that's being reiterated. One of the only Sabbath controversy stories in John, the man born blind. So that's it. There aren't even more miscellaneous, clearly negative Pharisee references in John than in Luke, or in Matthew than in Luke. So, what am I saying? There's no pattern. Jesus does not engage, the author does not engage with Pharisaism more in Matthew than in Luke, more in John than in Matthew, and so forth. It doesn't fall into this neat little Eohippus sequence. You got the little horse, and it gets bigger and bigger over time and becomes a big horse. Beloved of the redaction critics and the critical scholars. They're seeing a pattern where it's not there. My husband Tim recently was reminding me of a word, pareidolia, which is where you think you see some pattern, sort of like a Rorschach blot, and there isn't really a pattern there. You're imposing it based on some preoccupation in your own mind, and that's what we have going on here. Next time, I'm going to be talking about something that could be used as an attempted goalpost shift. Okay, it's not that John engages Pharisaism negatively overall more than the synoptics, but that he engages with Pharisaism more exclusively than the synoptics. That, he has fewer incidents, but he's focusing his attention all on the synoptics. And you already got a little preview of why that's wrong here, where I talked about the plots. They're involved with the priests every time. And so that's not true either. But I'm going to say that at more length next time. No, it's also not true that John focuses more exclusively on the Pharisees, or in one of Keener's phrases, that the Pharisees are identical with the opposition in John. Sometimes you really wonder, how can someone even say this when they're so familiar with the text of the gospel? Critical pareidolia. We're seeing a development on the piece of toast, right? Or in the Rorschach blot where it's not really there. And as so often, that goes hand in hand with cherry picking. So I'll be talking more about that. John does not focus more exclusively on the Pharisees next time. Thank you for coming with me on this journey through all the reasons why this particular development theory of the Gospels are all bunk, along with all of the others. They are all bunk. Please like and subscribe. And if you want to listen to this on audio only, remember you can do that on either Spotify or on Apple Podcasts. Go to lydiamcgrew.com to find the links to the most recent content in audio only from these videos. Thanks for watching. I'm Lydia McGrew.